I'm joined here in the studio by the Turkish military historian Mesut Uyar from Antalya Bilim University, and around the world in New York for us in Annandale-on-Hudson. Sean McMeekin is there. He's a historian who specialises in the First World War in Brighton in the UK. Annika Mombauer joins us from Brighton, a senior lecturer in modern European history at the Open University. Thank you to all three of you for your time. Mesut, when you're in your most reflective periods and you think about World War I, what are the first things that come to your mind?
Well, the conventional answer should be trenches, muddy fields of Flanders, and waste of human life. But as far as I am concerned, I am seeing it as the birth of a new era. It was a birth, messy, bloody, but again, it transformed the whole world. So as far as I'm concerned, I saw it a bloody, messy birth.
Sean, same question to you.
Well, I would also avoid the easy answer of the trenches on the Western Front, although perhaps for many people that is the standard image, Flanders, mud, and so forth. Now, I usually think of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. I sometimes call the war of the Ottoman succession. If the war made sense at all, I suppose, it was to dispose of what remained of the Ottoman inheritance, and it sparked a free-for-all. I think of the Russian Revolution. I think of the collapse of empires in the East, and unfortunately, I think that the war to end all war turned out to be a war that didn't end.
What strikes you the most when you think about World War I, Annika?
I think it is that it ushered in a century of warfare, really, across the world. And I also think of it in terms of the emotional legacy that it's left and the emotional impact, particularly in the Anglophone world, where the First World War continues to be seen as extremely relevant and moving.
How much, Annika, do you think Germany was solely to blame for the war? Many people always point the finger in one direction only and say if it hadn't been for the Germans, none of that would have happened.
Well, that's obviously the million-dollar question, and we haven't got long enough to go into it in great detail. I don't think many people would say Germany was solely responsible. You mentioned in your introductory piece that Germany backed Austro-Hungary. Without Austro-Hungary's desire to seek revenge for the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, there would have been no crisis with which Germany could have supported and no ally to back. But for me, it is Austria-Hungary and Germany together who create the so-called July crisis, to which then the other great powers react. Now, how they react also helps to exacerbate that crisis and to lead Europe to war, but that there is a crisis to begin with, a crisis that they can react to, I would say is the fault of the decision makers in Berlin and in Vienna.
Sean, do you agree?
Not entirely. I certainly think that the decision makers in Berlin and Vienna bear a responsibility in some ways for igniting the crisis in the first place. But you also have to look at Belgrade. You have to look at Serbia. You have to look at a plot which was literally launched in Belgrade to assassinate the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand. You also have to look at St. Petersburg and Paris, essentially a coordinated response. There was this game played where the ultimatum to Serbia, lodged by Vienna, was treated as this great shock that caught everyone by surprise. In fact, it was not a shock at all. Allied intelligence meant that the Russians knew about it, the French knew, and everyone knew that everyone knew, and the Russians and French coordinated a response. So in the end, I think all the powers bear different degrees of blame, and perhaps in different categories of blame. But I certainly don't think you can point simply to Berlin and Vienna.
Mesut, was it totally necessary? Was it inevitable? Would it have happened anyway? Or was it because of what Annika and Sean are saying, a series of events?
Well, from my perspective, because we have the luxury of hindsight, we can easily say that there was some chances to escape from July crisis. But as an Ottoman military historian, I should say that in 1913, the Ottoman leaders were expecting at least a bigger Balkan war or something major conflict in Europe. So we are talking about the Ottomans, and in 1913, they were adamant that a conflict is very soon, and they were desperately searching for alliance with the great powers. That was the reason how the Ottomans ended up an alliance with the Germans. So if the Ottomans expecting a big war in 1913, I don't think the other decision makers in Europe so naive that they were unaware about the developments in whole Europe. I mean, there were chances to escape from the July crisis, but I have serious doubts that after the July crisis, there would be September crisis, October crisis, or some other crisis during the year 1915. What I understand from the mentality, when I pay attention to the context, I am more than sure that the war was coming, and that was the reason why some minor powers like the Ottomans tried to side with the big powers in order to survive from the war.
We're going to look at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the involvement of the Ottoman Empire in more detail later in this special program. Annika, what about this being more than a war fought by white Europeans? Because for so long, you're talking to us from the UK, the British Empire brought hundreds of thousands of soldiers from the Indian subcontinent. They came from the Caribbean. The French brought them from North Africa. And the involvement of those non-European soldiers was ignored for so long. Just talk to us about their contribution.
Yes, you're quite right. For too long, this has been very Europe-focused, and within that, a very white war. And that has really changed as historians have started to look much more at the war being a global war, and there having been contributions made from all around the world. And it's interesting to see how in commemorations such as they happened today, that is very much at the foreground. I think the contribution made by global troops and the global aspect to the war is twofold. So on the one hand, you obviously have, as you say, millions of troops bolstering the war effort for Britain and also for France. 1.3 million Indian soldiers, for example, who were deployed as part of Britain's war effort. So you have that contribution in terms of manpower. But on the other hand, there are the often overlooked global theatres of war, which actually contributed significantly to the outcome of the war. And they have for too long, I think, been regarded as mere sideshows, but actually they are just as important in ending the war in the way that it finally ended with a victory for the Allies.
And Sean, you're speaking to us from the United States. It entered the war in 1917. Would the result have been the same if the US had not entered the conflict?
No, I think the result would have been quite different. In fact, if you actually look at the end of the war, the Germans very clearly lost the war on the Western Front, but they never really lost in the East. They actually had 1 million troops occupying what remained of the former Tsarist Russian Empire, including 600,000 in Ukraine alone. I think without the American intervention, there would have had to have been some sort of negotiated stalemate settlement. The Germans actually, as I was saying, were actually winning the war in the East. I think if there was any intention of the American intervention, it was to bring the war to a decisive conclusion, as Wilson said, to make the world safe for democracy, to end all war. Instead, in my view, the American intervention essentially made the world safe for communism. By defeating the Germans and, in the end, essentially allowing the Bolsheviks to escape and emerge and survive in power in Russia.
Okay, I think, Sean, when he says the East, I'm not a military historian, I think he means the fight against the Russians. So there was
that's correct.
Right? There was the Schlieffen Plan, the German plan to fight on both fronts, on the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Was that a mistake? Did they overextend themselves too much? Isn't that also the theory about their weakness in the Second World War, that they were fighting on those two fronts, the Eastern and the Western?
Well, I think the Germans simply had no chances because of geography, because lacking natural borders. The Germans had two enemies, one at the east, one at the west, and they did not have two separate armies to do the job for them. We need to pay attention some of the things that was affecting the military decision makers at that time. They were expecting a short, bloody but a short war. So the Germans were thinking that by making use of their railways, superior mobilization system, and their better command and control system, they were thinking that if we hit the French first and kick them out of the war, we would have ample time to move to the east, because the Russians, as always, would be slow to mobilize their forces. So the Germans did not expect a Russian offensive operation, at least in 2 months period. But against their expectations, the Russians did attack to the East Prussia, and this changed the balances of the German plan. the major issue that most people forget about, first of all, was a war with limited mobilization. So although there was vehicles, mechanized transport system, but very primitive. So when you initiate a maneuvers, whatever the value of your grand plans, the infantry and the artillery unable to move that quick in that period of time. So that was a big mistake, but we understand it with as I said, because we know all the details.
Okay, Mesut and Sean, you're going to be with us later in the program, but Annika, we're going to let you go, so I'll just give you the final say. As a military historian, a historian of the situation as it is in modern Europe, which I suppose is the past 100 years or so, is it? Do you ever consider the justness of World War I, or is that better left to philosophers? The just war theory, including also the idea that war is not always the worst option.
Well, that's certainly how it appeared to many contemporaries at the time, particularly those people in Germany, for example, who pushed for this war repeatedly and over again. They want to have a war before it's too late, and they feel that a war is not the worst outcome of the international crisis of the summer of 1914, which, in my opinion, is one of the reasons why the war breaks out in the first place. We, of course, do have the benefit of hindsight, so we understand the horror that is unleashed by these seemingly easily taken decisions. The men who take those decisions don't have that benefit of hindsight. They are thinking they're unleashing a war that is knowable, and they are looking at the future in which wars may no longer be possible, and for them that is more frightening than having the war in the first place. So with that in mind, I think, and your question about the just war, almost everybody who went to war in 1914 went on the assumption that they were fighting in a just war. Everybody thought they were fighting in a defensive war. Clearly, that can't have been true for everybody, but that's certainly what motivated everybody who volunteered to go to war between 1914 and 1918.
Okay, Mesut, as I say, and Sean, we'll hear from you a little later in the programme. Annika, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this special edition of The Newsmakers. You, stay with us after the break. We're going to ask whether the Treaty of Versailles led to the rise of fascism and if we're seeing its return in Europe. And we'll be live at a World War I battlefield. We're going to examine the post-war collapse of the Ottoman Empire.